Well, this is a little different from the kind of students I usually have at 8 o'clock in the morning, so this is a nice, refreshing change. Everybody's in the right place, I hope. Kansas, its history and image. Okay. How many of you are enrolled in other classes in the Kansas series? Most of you. Okay, very good. That was my idea, by the way. So I'm Jim Leiker. I'm director of the Kansas Studies Institute here at Johnson County Community College. When I'm not doing that, I'm also an associate professor of history. I've been teaching history now for 18 years, 9 of those at Johnson County Community College, and maybe more importantly than those things, I'm also a native Kansan. I originate from the western part of the state, did 2 degrees from Fort Hays and a degree from KU, and that doesn't affect my prejudice against Missouri in the slightest. I would like to pass around an attendance roster. Continuing ed would like us to keep track of who actually shows up. So if you would, just locate your name somewhere on one of these yellow sheets, and if you would, sign next to your name. And whoever gets this last, if you would just return it to me during the break. This will be a 2-hour presentation, and we'll take about a 10-minute break during the first hour. In the back, Dane Hartwell will be recording this. Just pay no attention to that man behind the camera. Everything completely natural here. Well, the title of this is Kansas, Its History and Image. So I guess I'll start with a question for you. What images pop into your mind when I throw out the word Kansas? Free State. Free State? What else? Sunflower, Jayhawker. What else? Wheat. Okay. Wizard of Oz. Yeah, okay. It didn't take us long to get to that one. So, well, when I talk about history and image, let me be clear what I'm talking about. I think it's unfair to dichotomize these two things like one is the truth, as if history is the real and the image is the myth, the perception. In fact, these two things are very much interrelated. What people believe about themselves and their state really influences the way that they behave, and that's going to influence the way history looks. And likewise, as I like to tell students, history itself is not a science. It's largely a subjective enterprise. So the way I teach the history of Kansas is a little different and emphasizes different priorities from someone else who would teach it. So I'm going to encourage you to look at these two things tonight as very much intertwined, that in fact they sort of evolve together over Kansas's 150-year history. Now, it is impossible, repeat, impossible, for me to comprehensively talk about this in 2 hours. We offer an entire semester here on Kansas history. So since I'm the teacher, I get to pick and choose the things that I talk about. So what I'm going to do this evening is to focus on 3 dominant images of Kansas. And then I'm going to compare how those line up against the history. But always remember, history and image intertwined. The first one you'll immediately recognize, the Free State. I think everybody is familiar with this mural in the state capitol. This was done by the artist John Stuart Curie. When this was commissioned back around 1940, and it was first depicted on the interior wall of the State House Capitol, it actually aroused quite a bit of controversy. This likening of Kansas to John Brown, a wild-eyed lunatic, a fanatic who murdered in the name of freeing slaves, that wasn't quite the image that the tourist bureaus of Kansas wanted to project back at the end of the Great Depression. John Stuart Curie was actually never paid for this mural. He never signed his name to it, and he left the state in disgust and never did any work for the state of Kansas again. So I find it interesting that this icon of the Free State actually originated in a bit of controversy. But at any rate, I think everyone probably knows what we're talking about when I throw out the term the Free State. It represents the struggle of Kansans to stop the expansion of slavery. And that is what causes a lot of locals, especially in northeast Kansas, to claim that the Civil War started here. So the notion that Kansas has always been front and center in protecting human freedom, especially African American freedom. That's something that's very much intertwined with this image. So what we'll do tonight is look at the reality behind all of that. You might be familiar with an organization today calling itself Freedom's Frontier, which is a partnership between a number of counties in eastern Kansas and western Missouri. It's got quite a bit of federal support, again arguing that this area was seminal in the story of freedom's advance. The second image you might be less familiar with, namely that of the fiery state. Who knows what this is or where it's located? This is from the Garden of Eden, located in Lucas, Kansas. If you're familiar with that story, S.P. Dinsmore was an old cranky populist back at the turn of the 20th century who adorned his front yard with all of these bizarre concrete sculptures. And in this case, what you've got is labor crucified like Jesus. Now, what this image doesn't show you is who's crucifying him. Namely, bankers, lawyers, and capitalists, all the enemies of the working class back at the turn of the 20th century. So this fiery state image touches on this notion of Kansas as being a place of activism, of reform, of strange, radical new ideas. And believe it or not, 100 years ago, Kansas had that national reputation as being on the cutting edge of everything that was new and innovative. And then the third of these images that I'll dissect for you this evening, the one we probably deal with the most, the flat state. This might be a rural myth, but I would bet there's truth behind it. There's the story of the traveler on I-70 who enters Kansas from Colorado, and he's got a camera that's on autofocus. And the thing is constantly spinning, looking for something on the horizon to focus on, and not finding it. Okay. So as I travel around the country and I talk to people and tell them where I'm from, inevitably this is the one that I have to rebut. And I have to explain to people. Now, okay, you know they build the interstates on the flattest parts of the terrain, right? They put the road there on that particular spot for a reason. Now, all of you probably know that you don't have to get too far off of the interstates to discover that not all Kansas looks like that. But nonetheless, this image of Kansas as being flat, dull, dry, boring, nonetheless, like the free and the fiery state, that's an image we have to contend with. Now, notice that I've got all of these lined up real nice. Free state, fiery state, flat state, the three Fs. You're not going to find that in any Kansas history textbook. That's my creation. After all, it's my show tonight. I get to decide what the images are going to be. Okay. So let's take the free state image first of all. This one really goes back to the beginning of Kansas history itself in the 1850s during the territorial period. And to talk about that, you really have to look, first of all, at the KansasNebraska Act of 1854, sponsored by the Democratic politician Stephen Douglas, for whom Douglas County is named. Douglas basically proposed shrinking Indian territory, which included eastern Kansas at that time, and reducing it down to the state of present-day Oklahoma. So what that meant is that it opened up the area that we now call Kansas for settlement by white people. So this really had the potential to upset the balance between free states and slave states that was in the Union at that time. So Kansas, therefore, is going to become a battleground between these two factions. And consequently, it leads to this notion that the Civil War really had its origins here. Now, when Douglas proposed this, he also proposed as part of the act the doctrine of popular sovereignty, which means that the people are sovereign. In other words, let the people of the state of Kansas decide for themselves if they want to allow slavery here or prohibit it. I think perhaps Douglas was well-meaning. He might have expected some sort of calm, deliberate, rational discussion about the future of slavery. But that's, of course, not what happened. In the 1850s, this becomes bleeding Kansas, where abolitionists from the Northeast, pro-slavery factions from the South, many from Missouri, many from the old Midwest, gather in the eastern part of the state, and they start a variety of new communities which really are quite polarized. Now, for the most part, I think, and this is what I emphasize when I teach this topic, the bleeding Kansas story is one that has largely been exaggerated in terms of its violence. This term, bleeding Kansas, was really a creation of the national newspapers of the time. Just like today, the media played a large role in shaping people's perceptions. The best historical study that I've seen on bleeding Kansas suggests that probably no more than 150 people lost their lives during the territorial period. And not all of those were probably because of the slave controversy. You have to remember, Kansas was a frontier at that time. So you didn't have a lot in the way of law enforcement. There were people killing each other over land and other kinds of personal disputes. But at any rate, whether it was exaggerated or not, Kansas certainly becomes front and center in this large national discussion. You did have a strong abolitionist presence in Kansas. Abolitionists, of course, were people from the northeastern part of the country who believed that slavery was morally an abomination, and they saw no need to compromise with southern slave owners. Abolitionists are going to start the town of Lawrence. And so for that reason, during the 1850s and again during the Civil War, Lawrence will be ransacked by raiders from Missouri. The most notorious of these abolitionists was John Brown. And I would not say he was representative of most, but he seems to have his face attached to them the most when it comes to the history of Kansas. John Brown was originally from Ohio, had a large family, something like 20 children. I've had descendants of John Brown in class over the years. And John Brown definitely was someone who used violence as a way of trying to stop the expansion of slavery. You're probably all familiar with his actions at Pottawatomie Creek in 1856, which some say was a reaction against the sack of Lawrence a few weeks earlier. This notion today that Kansas played a role in stopping the expansion of slavery has led to some pretty, what's the word I want to say here, hostile relations with our neighbor to the east. Especially if you go to Lawrence, the abolitionist presence is still very much there. The main strip downtown, Massachusetts Street, named after the place where the first of these people came from. The Plymouth Congregational Church, just a block to the west of Mass Street. Oldest congregation in Lawrence, again, started by abolitionist New Englanders way back then. Well, again then, this notion of Kansas as the Free State is something that continues forward into the Civil War period, and then later with African American settlement. In 1861, when the Civil War begins, Kansas actually played a prominent role in bringing African Americans into the mainstream. Senator Jim Lane, who was a close friend of Abraham Lincoln and longtime resident of Lawrence, raised the first regiment from Kansas that recruited African Americans into military service. So if you've seen the movie Glory and you're familiar with the story of black soldiers in the Civil War, Kansas was actually leading the way on that particular story. Also, both during the territorial period and during the Civil War, Kansas was quite active on the Underground Railroad of helping slaves to escape from southern slavery and make their way north eventually to Canada. So Kansas has a lot to be proud of in that sense of standing up against bigotry, racial intolerance, and whether that's deserved or not, clearly a lot of African Americans thought that it was. When you get into the settlement period after the Civil War, African Americans are going to come to Kansas by the thousands, all on this assumption that Kansas is a place of sanctuary from racism, from bigotry, a place where black people can get a fair break. In 1878 and 79, you see a major movement of the exodusters. This was a movement of 26,000 African Americans, 26,000, huge numbers, who left the South in the aftermath of Reconstruction and came here. Many of them walked up the Mississippi River during the wintertime when it was frozen. They arrived in St. Louis and then crossed through Missouri on the Missouri River and eventually arrived in places like Leavenworth, Topeka, Kansas City, and Lawrence. Now, many of these exodusters did not stay. Many of them kept moving on to places like Colorado and Minnesota. Some of them did stay. There's a large black community in Topeka today that traces descent from the exodusters. And question, does anyone know the origin of the term exodusters? Doesn't have anything to do with Kansas being dusty. How about the second book of the Bible, which is about the story of Moses leading his people out of slavery into a promised land. So I find it curious that many African Americans saw Kansas as that promised land. The stories that they had heard about John Brown and other abolitionist activities was really something that endeared them to this place. You also saw a number of civilian establishments created that were all African American populated. And the most famous of these was Nicodemus. Nicodemus was started in the northwestern part of the state in Graham County, not too far from where I grew up near Hayes. At its peak in the 1880s, Nicodemus was an all-black settlement that had something like 1,000 people. Now that doesn't sound big by today's standards, but for the standards of that time, that was considerable. In Nicodemus, you had black-owned banks, schools, businesses, churches. It was quite an active, thriving little community. And periodically across the South, you would see posters, handbills being put up like this. I'll let you read this on your own, but it gives you the impression, again, that in the 1870s and 80s, many blacks who are living in a kind of a desperate time in the South after Reconstruction, many of them were willing to make a try to establish new homes here in the West. What eventually hurts Nicodemus was the fact that they did not obtain a railroad depot. So when the Union Pacific Railroad builds about 50 miles to the south and bypasses them, the town very quickly loses population. And today there's maybe, Martha, what did you say, 30 people? That's probably optimistic. Does that sound about right? Okay. By the way, Nicodemus was not the only all-black settlement. There were, we think, dozens that were established. And just like the rest of Kansas, a lot of them eventually became ghost towns. So how accurate then is this image of the free state? Just how free was Kansas? Well, historians are trying to answer that question. And some of what they're discovering isn't pretty. First of all, the origins of the anti-slavery movement, we have always assumed, were created by the abolitionists. We've always assumed that territorial Kansas was this dichotomy between Southerners who wanted slavery, abolitionists who didn't want it, and those were the only two sides. In fact, what historians are starting to uncover is that the Free State movement, that was its official name, was not really abolitionist in nature. Rather, that anti-slavery movement had its origins not in the liberal part of the country in the Northeast, but rather in the old Northwest. So we're talking here about states like Ohio, Indiana, Iowa, that butt up against the South, where slavery was not practiced. But nonetheless, you had a kind of racism and a kind of anti-black bigotry that was very strong in those states. Later in the 20th century, southern Indiana would be the center of the Ku Klux Klan. So as those people are coming to Kansas and bringing their ideas with them, yes, they're anti-slavery, but they're not necessarily pro-black equality. Okay, it's one thing to hate slavery, it's another thing to believe that blacks and whites should be able to live together. Today we're really seeing that the Free State movement was kind of a moderate alternative between those two other polar extremes. And it's the Free State movement that in 1859 will draft the Wyandotte Constitution, and it's so named because that's where it was originally drafted. The Wyandotte Constitution certainly did include a provision that would have brought Kansas into the Union a year later as a place that prohibits slavery. But here was the rub. The Wyandotte Constitution also would have excluded free blacks from living here. So you keep slavery out by keeping out all black people. Now, if you think that that wasn't done elsewhere, Oregon actually had that going back to the 1840s, and it lasted for several decades. And many of the founders of Oregon, like the Free Staters, came from the same place, states like Missouri and the old Northwest. Kansas does come into the Union the following year in 1861 with no such provision. But that doesn't mean that Kansas is necessarily warm and welcoming when it comes to racial minorities. During the 1860s, in the aftermath of the Civil War, there were a number of debates over African American suffrage. And in fact, Kansas did not grant to black men the right to vote until they were forced to do so by the 15th U.S. Amendment to the Constitution in 1870. So repeatedly, Kansas voters went to the polls and rejected any attempt at African American suffrage. Then finally, in 1870, black men do get that right in Kansas. Bit of a digression. When do black women get the right to vote? At the same time, white women get the right to vote. 1920, after World War I. Okay, these things take a little while. Okay. A lot of historians make a big deal about the numbers of blacks who come to Kansas after the Civil War seeking freedom from oppression and all of that good stuff. But what they don't pay a lot of attention to until recently is an increase also in lynching violence. There were a fair number of lynchings in Kansas that start in the 1870s. And I'll give you some precise numbers, if I can. Between 1861, beginning of the Civil War, and 1931, something like 40 black men were lynched in the state of Kansas. Now that is considerably lower than what was going on in the South at that time. But it's clearly enough to raise a question or two that Kansas was really a free and welcoming place. Some of these lynchings were quite horrific, both in Leavenworth as well as in Fort Scott, where Gordon Parks was from. We know of at least 2 cases in both where men were burned alive in the process of being lynched. Okay, so again, this is not something exactly that Kansans like to talk about on their celebratory days. Finally, if you're going to test this image of the Free State, you have to talk a little bit also about racial segregation. In the 1880s, for the first time, the state legislature allowed communities that had more than 10,000 people the right to segregate public schools. So any city that had more than 10,000 was classified as a first-class city. And consequently, if they wished to, the school districts could mandate segregation of the races. Now, that did not apply to high school, which few African Americans attended at the time, and it didn't apply to smaller cities. You also saw a kind of informal racial segregation which prevailed in theaters, restaurants, parks, carnivals. You can see all kinds of examples of this in Kansas right down into the civil rights era. One of my friends and colleagues, Deborah Dandridge, who works with the archives at KU, tells a story about how when she was growing up in Topeka, a young black girl, this would have been, I don't want to date Deborah, so I'm not going to give this away, but she tells a story of sneaking into the Topeka municipal pool and sticking her big toe in the water. When that was discovered the next day, the city officials had to drain the pool lest the water in it contaminate or infect any white person's skin. So stories like that actually proliferated right up until about the 1950s and 60s. So where do we get this image of the Free State from? Okay, why do we like to keep talking about that? I would suggest that maybe we shouldn't talk about the Free State. Maybe we ought to talk a little bit more about the Free Town. So Free State Brewery on Mass Street in Lawrence serves the best oatmeal stout that I'm aware of. KU, City of Lawrence, has long championed itself as a blue island in a sea of red on political matters, cultural matters. Lawrence is practically the only community that tends to swing to the left in Kansas. So if you look at just Lawrence, you could say, okay, well, that's where it was free. One of my old friends and colleagues some years back, Rusty Monholland, did a book titled This is America with a question mark called The 60s in Lawrence, Kansas. And what he really argues is that not even Lawrence has really lived up to this image of the free town. You had in Lawrence public debates over things like race, over the environment, over gay marriage, which is still an ongoing topic of discussion today. And especially during the 1960s, you had all of the cultural wars, all of the fights over Vietnam, over feminism, over every issue you could imagine happening in Lawrence. So it's never been a community that has spoken with any kind of unanimity. Nonetheless, this image of Kansas as being a place of racial harmony and activism has inspired an awful lot of things. And that brings me to the Brown versus Board of Education case of Topeka, which starts there and ends up in the lap of the U.S. Supreme Court in 1954. You're probably all familiar with this story, which again has been perpetrated by the media, that a little girl named Linda Brown lived so far away from lived very close actually to a perfectly good white school and had to cross through all of the dangerous railroad tracks and neighborhoods to go to the black school where she was forced by law to attend. In fact, the black schools in Topeka in the 1940s and 50s were recognized as quite good. Okay? The graduates of those schools were quite proud of their school system. And Linda Brown was not exactly an impoverished little girl. Her father was very active with the local branch of the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. So the Brown case originates in Kansas, but eventually it consolidates with 5 other states. And by the time it reaches the laps of the 9 wise men in Washington, D.C. on the U.S. Supreme Court, the notion that Kansas even practiced segregation was something that was surprising to a lot of Americans. A lot of people nationwide were saying, wait a minute, wasn't that the place where John Brown stopped slavery? I didn't know they even had segregation there. Now, a lot of people assume that the case was named the way it was because they were playing off of that image of the Free State. In fact, when you consolidate cases that go to the Supreme Court, they always go in alphabetical order, so hence the thing is named Brown. But nonetheless, since 1954, Kansans have been very proud and eager to claim this landmark case, which ordered the desegregation of public schools, as just another chapter in Kansas's long history of racial progress. I suspect through the rest of this year, you're going to hear a lot more about this, of how the Free State narrative is being brought forward into the 20th century, now to include the more recent civil rights history. Okay, so be prepared for that, I think, in the newspapers and the media over the next few months. Okay. Are there any questions about the Free State image before we move on a little bit? I think like all of these images, it's somewhat of a mixed bag. Well, let's take a look at the fiery state. And this image really follows from the early pioneer experience, which has almost nothing to do with race and has everything to do with class. So how has Kansas been when it comes to class issues? Western Kansas especially was promoted quite vigorously by people called boosters. So boosterism is simply a nice synonym for good salesmanship. A booster was any railroad developer, town promoter, speculator, businessman who was trying to attract migrants into the far western parts of the state. So it was generally good business to try to build towns out in those areas. Many of these boosters resorted to, dare I say, exaggerated depictions of what Kansas's potential was like. So a lot of booster propaganda showed the average watermelon grown on a Kansas farm as being the size of a house, or corn stalks that stood up 20 feet in the air. You also had these kind of strange theories. Rain follows the plow. Believe it or not, there was a kind of pseudoscience at that time which said that if you plow into the earth, it will release certain nutrients from the soil that will drift up into the clouds, and it acts as a seeding process, and that will basically cause those clouds to drop rain. So literally they did believe, or at least they wanted to believe, that rain does follow the plow. If you plow it, the rain will come. To kind of borrow from Field of Dreams. So you have to do something to try to entice potential farmers into that land out there west of the 100th meridian, right around Salina. Boosters did their best, but really the one act of government which did more than any other to promote the settlement of Kansas was the 1862 Homestead Act. The terms of this act, which were passed by the Lincoln administration, said that if you improve a patch of land, you can, after 5 years, lay free, clear title to it up to 160 acres. Okay, so 160 acres of free land, provided that you improve that land after a period of usually 3 to 5 years. It varied from place to place. I knew a lot of people growing up in western Kansas who liked to claim that their ancestors were hard-working pioneers who had to work for everything. Well, yeah, they certainly worked hard, but when you get right down to it, most of them originally got their land for free. Okay, this was a kind of land welfare. And it was not a bad idea, trying to fill up the Great Plains by encouraging settlement there. The problem with the Homestead Act is how they defined improved. Now, technically, they meant improving, you put a farm on it. You make the land yield something. You produce agriculture. Oftentimes, the Homestead Act would attract crooks and swindlers who would take a couple of pieces of lumber, nail them together, stick them in the ground. Oh yeah, I'm building a house. I improved it. That was enough to meet the terms of the local land office, and that land became yours. Do you live on that land? Probably not. You sell it for a 100% profit to the next schmuck that comes down out of the railroad line. Something like 90% of all land in the American West that was claimed under the Homestead Act was not claimed by individual families, but rather by corporations, by large businesses. So the Homestead Act played a very small role in kind of redistributing people out into the far reaches of the state. Most folks like this who lived in a sod house and lived on prairie land, most people probably, average working people, probably had a mortgage that they had to pay to some distant banker. And they did not get to own that land outright. Okay. Now, talking about this then, if you're going to talk about the fiery state, what eventually causes Kansans to become fiery, you have to look a little bit at actual pioneer life, the image versus the reality. Pioneer life was certainly no picnic. Especially in the 1870s and then again in the 1890s, western Kansas was assailed with drought. Okay, so this is a time of very low rainfall, very active windstorms, and very low harvests. So many farmers, in fact, went bankrupt, had to sell their land at a loss, and then move on to the big cities. While they're living in these kinds of places, far from roads, far from trains, far from settled communities, life could get very difficult. When you lived in a sod house, which was actually a very clever Plains kind of innovation, it's a house built entirely out of mud bricks that you get by tearing up the topsoil. It provides for a certain minimum degree of comfort, but the grass roof on the top was perfect as a home for snakes, especially rattlers. So when people went to bed at night, if they were smart, they learned to cover up with a sheet just in case a snake would pop out of the roof in the middle of the night. Also, during a rain, the roof on a sod house, it's a leaky sieve. It doesn't do a very good job of keeping the moisture out. Pioneer families would use certain tricks like put a fork or a spoon up into the roof at night and a bucket, and that would actually divert the flow of water, and then you have to get up every few minutes and empty the pails. Pioneer life was especially hard on women. Okay, this is the Victorian era when women are used to a certain kind of domestic lifestyle. So to come out to an environment like this where you're cut off socially from other families, where the wind never backs up, the wind is constantly howling, this can be a very depressed, very lonely kind of existence. There was a case near Goodland, Kansas, far out on the Colorado border in the 1890s, of a woman who was driven insane by the constant howling wind, killed herself and her children with a butcher knife. So the desolation of pioneer life, although we celebrate it today, it had a real dark, grim, and depressing side. It doesn't help the fact that many of those people considered themselves exploited by big business. So resentment of corporations, of banks, of faraway distant law firms, this is becoming part of the pioneer mentality as you get into the later part of the 19th century. Another synonym for big business, Eastern establishment. Many pioneers, especially in the western part of the state, grew very resentful of faraway distant elites who seemed to have all of this control over their lives. So consequently, by the 1890s, many of them are experimenting with a new third political party called Populism. So for a brief time, the Populists were a major active political force in American society. The Populists, which basically meant the People's Party, that was their actual official name, the People's Party favored a lot of things. First of all, it championed rural values. Okay, so Populists were all about kind of looking down on the elites in the big cities and glorifying people from small towns, rural areas who make their living as farmers. In terms of the policies that they wanted, Populists wanted government regulation of the railroads. Now, I know we're in an age today where nobody seems to want government regulation of anything, but back at the turn of the 20th century, it was a different story. Populists wanted government control of the railroads. They wanted an 8-hour workday. Now, the reason for this is that they were trying to make an alliance with urban workers, with unions, with factory workers in the big cities, and one of the conditions that those groups wanted was the 8-hour workday. They wanted to take America also off of the gold standard. So this was especially something that was championed by the great orator William Jennings Bryan, who was considered a populist hero. William Jennings Bryan, when he ran for the presidency in 1896, gave a famous Cross of Gold speech. Essentially what he wanted to do was to take America off the gold standard, in which no dollar could be printed unless there was an equivalent value of gold that was sitting in a government depository. By doing away with the gold standard and going completely to a greenback policy, you give the federal government the power to print as much paper money as it wants. Why would you want that? Doesn't that contribute to inflation? The more paper money out there, the less things are worth. Who does inflation help? Somewhat. Specific kind of business? Actually, the other. Not the bankers, but the people who owe the banks. Inflation is very good for people in debt because the value of your loan is worth less in the future if there is inflation in the meantime. So farmers especially, farmers are mostly cash poor and usually always have a mortgage. So populists were demanding an awful lot of things, among them again a glorification of rural culture. You had a lot of populist orators going around the country at that time, especially in Kansas, people like this lady, Mary Elizabeth Lise, who was saying that farmers need to raise less corn and more hay. Farmers need to get active, they need to become reformers, they need to get involved in the political process. Until they do, they're always going to be at the mercy of big businesses in the East and the politicians who support them. Well, what you're really looking at here then with this agrarian radicalism is a class movement. And it was a class movement that began in the countryside but eventually extends to the cities. Somebody who was really an enemy of the populists was this fellow, William Allen White, editor of the Emporia Gazette, which surprisingly was a national periodical, national newspaper back at that time. I like this quote from William Allen White. When anything is going to happen in this country, it happens first in Kansas. Abolition, prohibition, populism, these things come popping out of Kansas like bats out of hell. Okay, that's something you could say and get away with back around the year 1900. White was a good friend of Teddy Roosevelt, and Teddy Roosevelt was a good Republican. So Republicans and populists, not the best of friends. As the story goes, William Allen White, who was a devout Republican his entire life, always believed that big business has an important role to play in developing this country. The story goes that on the streets of Emporia, while White was walking to work one day, a bunch of these young populist, for lack of a better word, redneck types, people out of the country, came up to him and they say, "Oh, look at the sissy boy with his nice fancy clothes and his city polished shoes," and they kicked dirt all over his pant cuffs and messed up his tie and kind of made fun of him as a rube, as a city dude. White goes back to his office and he writes a very sarcastic editorial titled, "What's the Matter with Kansas?" And you have to understand that this was a sarcastic slap at the populace. So let me read you a little bit from his article, "What's the Matter with Kansas?" And again, I'll try to put sufficient sarcasm in my voice so you can understand here what he's saying. "Go east and you hear them laugh at Kansas. Go west and they sneer at her. Go south and they cuss her. Go north and they've forgotten her. Go into any crowd of intelligent people gathered anywhere on the globe and you will find the Kansas man on the defensive. What's the matter with Kansas? We have discovered a kid without a law practice and have decided to run him for Attorney General. Then, for fear some hint that the state had become respectable might percolate through the civilized portions of the nation, we have decided to send 3 or 4 harpies," I think he's talking about Mary Elizabeth Lise here, 3 or 4 harpies out lecturing telling the people that Kansas is raising hell and letting the corn go to weed. We don't need population. We don't need wealth. We don't need well-dressed men on the streets. We don't need cities on the fertile prairies. Oh yes, Kansas is a great state. Here are people fleeing it by the score every day, capital going out of the state by the hundreds of dollars, and every industry but farming paralyzed because its products have to go across the ocean before they find a laboring man at work who can afford to buy them. Let's not stop there. Let's drive all the decent, self-respecting men out of the state. What we need is not mill hands to eat our meat, nor factory hands to eat our wheat, nor cities to oppress the farmer by consuming his butter and eggs and chickens and produce. What's the matter with Kansas? Nothing. Nothing under the sun. She's losing her wealth, population, and standing, but there's absolutely nothing wrong with Kansas, where every prospect pleases and only man is vile. Was that enough sarcasm for you? So I hope I got that through. So White clearly thought that the populist movement was driving out of the state the better kinds of people who had the resources, the education, the expertise to make a strong business foundation here. And that speaks a little bit to the class resentments that kind of, I think, define that entire period. Are there any questions before we go on? Okay. Well, even though White disparaged populism quite a bit, it did have its advantages. It did have its successes. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the progressive achievements that Kansas did pull off. I'll talk a little bit about Carrie Nation and Prohibition, which those are all really part of the same package. Kansas was progressive on many fronts. So the populists notwithstanding, you did have a good, strong Republican Party here in the Teddy Roosevelt mode that led Kansas into some very interesting things. First of all, Kansas was the first state in the Union to pass laws regulating clean food, drugs, and water. Okay, so a good several years before the federal government gets into the business of regulating the meat industry after the publication of Upton Sinclair's The Jungle in 1906, Kansas was already ahead of the game on that one. Kansas did elect a populist governor. Okay, so for a brief time in the 1890s, you did have someone who came from that background. Kansas at that time was recognized as having strong state schools as well as very good agricultural experiment stations. So when I talk public education, I'm not necessarily talking about the K-12 variety. Kansas led the country in terms of establishing adult education, especially for farmers in the western part of the state who had to learn new methods and new tactics for trying to plant in what is a very dry, arid kind of environment. Kansas was one of the first states to use the professional city manager system at a time when most city governments were elected and you had strong mayors who were really nothing more than political bosses. Kansas was one of the first to bring in professional administrators with degrees who understood a little bit about politics and were somewhat isolated from the ups and downs of the electorate. Kansas even had quite a bit, believe it or not, of a socialist tradition. In the southeast part of the state, a little town called Girard, Kansas. I think I heard murmurs of recognition. Some of you know where Girard is. When you go to Girard today, you might be surprised at the exceptionally large post office that they have. The reason for that post office was built to handle the enormous processing of the little blue books, which were published by Haldeman Julius. Girard, Kansas was kind of a center for socialist activity, and it put out a number of small publications which championed the rights of working people, the rights of labor unions, the rights of really everybody. Upton Sinclair's book, The Jungle, was first published in Girard, Kansas, and then eventually becomes national. So ask anybody in the first decade of the 20th century what they thought about Kansas, and they would have said, you know, it's kind of a reform-minded place. It's progressive, it's fiery, it's where people get involved in big national debates. Okay, so it's none of the flat, dull kind of image that somewhat permeates the state today. In terms of women, Kansas actually fared quite well on that front also. In Kansas, women had some of the first rights to divorce in the country, as well as to inherit property. There were 15 female mayors in Kansas as of the year 1900. And they were some of the first to obtain suffrage rights when it came to local elections. Okay, so again, Kansas was kind of front and center when it came to feminist issues. Now, what I've been giving you is, at least in my mind, somewhat of the positive. I come from an old German Catholic family, so this to me is going to be a negative, I'm afraid. Kansas also led the country in Prohibition. And Prohibition actually flows very much out of these other progressive achievements that I've been talking about. The same people who believed in cleaning up government, getting banks and businesses off the backs of the little guy, also tended to be fairly church-going conservative people who thought that the real, true best thing we can do for the state is to eliminate the drinking, the manufacture, the sale of alcohol. Kansas was a dry state from 1881, long before it was tried at the federal level, from 1881 until 1949. So this was part of a long moral reform effort to try to clean up the population by eliminating booze. Did they eliminate booze? No. There was an old saying that Kansans would continue to vote for Prohibition as long as they could stagger to the polls. Okay. Whenever you talk about Prohibition, you have to talk a little bit about Carrie Nation. Interesting case, famous for what were called her hatchetations. That's the classic iconic picture of Carrie Nation. Carrie Nation was originally from Kentucky. As the story goes, her first husband was quite a drunkard, left her, died an early death because of alcohol-related illness. She eventually remarried and moved to Medicine Lodge, Kansas, way down on the Oklahoma border, quite a way south of Wichita. And it's there that she became a lecturer for the WCTU, which stands for Women's Christian Temperance Union. So starting in the late 1800s, Carrie Nation began traveling the country, and more precisely for our point, traveling Kansas, going to small towns, rural areas, even big cities, and speaking out against, or I should say, speaking out, explaining the evils of demon rum, as she called it. Her husband once joked with her that she could probably get more results with a hatchet than by standing at a podium. And so she actually took him at his word on that. Carrie Nation was arrested several times in her life, once on 12th Street in downtown Kansas City, for going into a saloon and smashing it, destroying the furniture, destroying the bar, destroying the glass behind the bar with her little hatchet. And she was rarely ever prosecuted because all of those establishments were illegal, at least in the state of Kansas. So that's how she was able to get away with so much of this. She was eventually arrested for vandalism and did serve a brief prison sentence here in Kansas City, Missouri. But what's interesting here is that Kansas's reputation as a dry state is going to long outlive Carrie Nation. So I'll come back to a little bit of this after the break. What happens after her time, after World War I, is that Kansas's image starts to take a dive. And it starts to be seen now as a flat, dull, boring kind of place. And this long historical association with Prohibition, long after the rest of the country abandoned it in 1933, has, I think, somewhat contributed to Kansas's deteriorating image. I know this is a question that's kept you all up at night, but is Kansas really flatter than a pancake? Believe it or not, there is a scientific study which answers that question for you.
We pay for that study.
Not going to touch that one. So. There was a study published in the journal called Improbable Research some years ago, and I think this is aptly named, Improbable Research. A study that was done by two geographers, one from Texas, the other from Arizona State. So in answer to your question, taxpayers from Texas and Arizona paid to find out if Kansas is flatter than a pancake. What these geographers did was to use digital landscaping, which is the hot new thing now in terms of GPS, of studying topography. And what they did by using that process was that they took a strip of highway just to the west of Wichita. So you'd be going from Wichita about to Dodge City, and used that and compared it to a pancake from IHOP. Just a regular old IHOP pancake. As you can notice, Kansas actually has a slope in the western part of the state. As you're going toward the Rocky Mountains, the terrain does go upward. But if you're looking at it on a micro level, it's pretty smooth, pretty flat. On the other hand, if you look at the average pancake, a well-cooked pancake made by IHOP, if you get up real close to it with laser imaging, there are these little nooks, crevices, and crannies within it. So, judge for yourself, but the scientific evidence seems to support the fact that, yes, Kansas is flatter than a pancake. Okay. About 4 years ago, I went on a Fulbright scholarship to the Middle East, and a fellow in Israel, of all places, said, Kansas, that's the place that's flatter than a pancake. Oh, God, even here. Even here. Well, clearly, Kansas's flat topography is something that was noticed by the first white people who came here. Back in 1541, the Spanish explorer Coronado led the first European expedition into what we now think was Kansas. If you believe the reports, Coronado made it right close to about the central part of the state around Salina. So just to the south and west of Salina, a little bit near the town of Lindsborg, there's a place there that's called Coronado Heights. But when Coronado came up into this vicinity looking for the fabled city of gold, which is what it was all about, he and his men were shocked, terrified really, by the absolute desolate flatness of the landscape. Now, consider where they came from. Spain is a country with a lot of mountains, rolling hills, forests, beaches. This is not something that Europeans had ever witnessed before, and it was probably like being on the ocean, monotonous and, again, in a way, terrifying. Coronado wrote in his journals that he and his men were so in fear of getting lost as they entered the Great Plains that they actually used a navigation system that's common on the ocean, where they would plant a flag with a sock that would gather the wind on one horizon, and then at the other end of the horizon would plant another and another and another. So every so many kilometers, they had these rows planted, and that's how they were able to navigate their way back south across the Great Plains to get back to their base in Mexico City. So clearly, when whites first came to Kansas, the flatness of the terrain was something that really bothered them. Now, this is also going to be the case when you get into the 19th century. Zebulon Pike of Pike's Peak fame. When Zebulon Pike came through here in the early 1800s, he pretty much said the same thing about what would become Kansas. Flat, dull, the grasses are not really good for much. There will probably never be agriculture here. Even though Pike was looking at thousands, hundreds of thousands of bison grazing on very rich prairie grasses, it never once entered his mind that that same land could someday be used for ranching, for livestock, for cattle. But it's really this fellow, Stephen Long, who leads another expedition through Kansas around 1820. It's Long that we credit for the phrase, the Great American Desert. And in fact, if you look at maps of the American West in the 19th century, before the Civil War, where Kansas is now, it didn't even have a name really. It was simply referred to as Great American Desert. So for better or worse, that image is kind of stuck in the heads of a lot of people who don't live here ever since. Now, this image of Kansas as being flat is about more than just topography. Probably won't surprise you any, but of the 50 states, Kansas consistently ranks last every year when it comes to tourism. If you take polls of people nationwide, they will almost always say that Kansas is at the bottom of the list when it comes to places that they would like to visit. We don't have beaches, mountains, the things that usually draw people on summer vacations. Kansas, not surprisingly, also has today an aging population. Many governors, for a long time now, have talked about the big problem in this state as being one of brain drain, of young college graduates having no opportunities here, and they leave and go somewhere else. Not only because the jobs are not available, but also because Kansas is not perceived anymore as a hip, cool place where young people want to be. The action is always some other place, but wherever it is, we know it ain't here. Okay. So how did Kansas become unhip, uncool? A lot of this goes back to the 1920s, to the post-World War I era, and it's the declining image of rural culture generally. The 1920 census was the first to reveal that more Americans lived in urban areas than other. So before 1920, more than half of Americans lived in small towns, which the census defines as about 5,000 people, or on a farm. 1920 is a bit of a turning point when America is becoming an urban society. And so consequently, rural areas like Kansas are going to lose a little bit of their allure in the process. I would argue, though, that probably the one fellow who did more to hurt the image of rural America was that guy, H.L. Mencken. Mencken was a journalist for the Baltimore Sun, a national newspaper, kind of an iconoclastic journalist, a lot like Sinclair Lewis. And back in the 1920s and 30s, Mencken wrote a number of very scathing essays in which he really lambasted America's rural population. This is the fellow who coined terms like redneck during the 1930s, describing working class people who are outside all the time getting a good sunburn. He scattered his essays quite generously with terms like hicks or boobs. People from kind of rural, lower class backgrounds, uneducated, don't wear shoes, go to church all the time, practice old-fashioned superstitious values, and really just haven't joined the 20th century yet. How many of you have seen the movie Inherit the Wind? It's an old film about the Scopes monkey trial. The role of the cynical reporter in that story was based on H.L. Mencken. I happen to know something about this because I played that role in a high school production of Inherit the Wind, and it kind of whetted my interest for H.L. Mencken ever since. Mencken also coined the phrase the Bible Belt, talking about, again, rural people with their backwards ways who, in the 1920s and 30s, were leaving places like Appalachia, the South, and the Plains states, and they were moving to big cities like Chicago, Cincinnati, New York. Most of you probably remember the strip Little Abner. Classic stuff that was created in that period. Little Abner and his whole family, bunch of hillbillies living in the sticks of the Appalachian Mountains. They put on their good coveralls to go to Sunday meetings, rarely put on shoes, just kind of backward hillbilly ways. Rural people started to be lampooned and caricatured in big city comics and journals, largely as a result of the popularity of ideas like those that were being offered by Mencken. By the way, the term Bible Belt, as he used it originally, was applied to the Midwest, not to the South. Okay, as far as he was concerned, that's where the real rural boobs lived. Kansas's rural image also takes a big hit during the Dust Bowl of the 1930s. And my colleague Martha Barzilay has taught the literature of the Dust Bowl in some of the previous Kansas series sessions. But the Dust Bowl is often remembered by people as kind of just a very bad time, almost of biblical proportions. The phrase Dust Bowl was actually coined by a journalist who was coming through the area. And as he was driving through the southwest part of the state, and he saw the disastrous effects of years of low rainfall, high winds, dirt, dust blowing around everywhere, he studied maps and used the phrase Dust Bowl to describe the great big oval-shaped area in the middle of the country where in the 1930s, combined with the Great Depression, the soil just seemed to be blowing away. A few facts about the Dust Bowl. A lot of terrible stories here of people who were driving in the middle of the day having to use their headlights because the sun was blocked out by the thick amazing dust. Something like 1/5 of all the topsoil of the Great Plains simply blew away during the 1930s. Some of that entered the upper stratosphere, mixed with clouds, and then it deposited showers of mud on ships on the North Atlantic Ocean after a big storm in 1935. So farmers in North Dakota, Texas, Oklahoma were making jokes that they were trading real estate with people on the other side of the continent, which in a sense they really weren't. You had occasions where children died of respiratory illnesses brought about by breathing too much dust. And lots of stories of people in vain trying to keep the dust out of their homes by putting wet towels along the windowsills at night. And in the morning, to no avail. They'd wake up and the only part of the pillow that was not covered with dust was the place where their head had left an impression. Today, environmental historians are looking at the Dust Bowl, and they believe that it had mostly man-made causes. That is, if you back up to the decade of the 1920s, H.L. Mencken's decade, when the price of wheat and other plains crops was very strong, farmers were going out into the prairies with mechanized tractors, ripping up the topsoil. Well, by doing that, they're destroying the grass cover, the anchor that keeps that soil bedded down, so that when you go several years without any rainfall and that dust becomes fine and thin, all it takes is a good strong wind and off it goes. We've had Dust Bowls since the 1930s, and some of them have been lessened in their circumstances because of things like terraces and irrigation. But the bottom line here is that in the 1930s, the Dust Bowl seems to become permanently intertwined with the state of Kansas. Local boosters in places like Dodge City and Liberal hated this term Dust Bowl. In fact, they produced brochures and videos claiming that it's just one big lie, it doesn't exist. Come on out here, keep planting, keep arriving. Times are prosperous out here in western Kansas. Well, clearly this is kind of a throwback to the old days when the ability to kind of ignore certain facts, certain realities was very keen. So by the 20s, 30s, people are thinking of Kansas in a different way. Okay, it's lost that edge, that activism that had always made it famous. But the one thing which, in my opinion, is going to cement Kansas's image as the flat, dull, boring place that it is, The Wizard of Oz. Now, to be fair, I actually do like the movie. I don't admit that too often, but it's had a bit of an impact on our state image. The Wizard of Oz, the movie, was based on a book written by L. Frank Baum back at the turn of the century. Baum always claimed that he never meant to do anything except write an entertaining children's tale. So you all know the story of little Dorothy from Kansas who gets sucked up by a tornado with her little dog Toto, and she ends up in this magical place. What a lot of people don't know about L. Frank Baum was that he experimented for a while with the populist movement. So some scholars, and that's all this is speculation, some scholars speculate that The Wizard of Oz is in fact more than just a little children's story, but that it is in fact a piece of populist propaganda. Now, how could that be? Well, there are a lot of coincidences here that do seem to add up. First of all, the scarecrow. Who works with straw a lot? How about oppressed farmers? The Tin Man. Maybe the industrial worker locked up in a metal steel factory all day long who lacks a heart because he's cut off from nature. Some think that the role of the cowardly lion in The Wizard of Oz is really none other than William Jennings Bryan himself, who, as far as Baum was concerned, was somebody who once championed the rights of the little guy, but once he started making a stab for the presidency, he sold out and forgot his populist roots. Cowardly lion, Bryan was often referred to as a lion when it came to politics and oratory. The Yellow Brick Road has been interpreted as the populist agenda of getting us off the gold standard and getting us to the Emerald City. Emerald, a green color, green representing the money-back policy. that the populists were all in favor of. And of course, where is this Emerald City where the wizard lives? This would be Washington, D.C., the nation's capital. And who, after all, is the wizard? Well, if you've seen the movie, the wizard is really just a buffoon who stands behind a curtain and pulls things. He has a big face, but he doesn't have any real power. Gee, who might that be in Washington, D.C.? How about the president who takes his orders from the real rulers of Oz? And who would those be? The Wicked Witch of the West, namely the railroad companies, versus the Good Witch of the East. So Baum himself never claimed that this was anything more than entertainment, but when you look at all of those coincidences, it's easy to suppose that he chose Kansas as the site of his story simply because of that earlier association as a fiery place devoted to activism. Now, in the movie, of course, Dorothy has little red ruby slippers, right? But in the book, her slippers are emerald, green. Again, the color of the populace, and that's the green that will get her home. You probably remember from when MGM released that movie in 1939, the parts that were set in Kansas was done in black and white. And then when Little Dorothy enters Oz, then the color kicks in. So again, the film's producers chose to draw that stark contrast between the colorful, dramatic Oz and Kansas, again, as a dull, flat, kind of lifeless place. Now, originally when the movie Wizard of Oz came out, it didn't make such a great splash. It was actually overshadowed by Gone with the Wind, which came out the same year. But in the 1950s, the television networks began airing The Wizard of Oz on a pretty regular basis, at least once a year. And so most of the classic lines, like "We're not in Kansas anymore, Toto," is not something that people got from the 1939 original release, but from the constant repetition of the film playing on network television in the 1950s. So for people who were coming of age during the Cold War, when TV was just first starting to enter the living room, again, The Wizard of Oz kind of cements Kansas's reputation. Now, the way I just interpreted that clip could be that Kansas is actually not such a bad place. Okay, Dorothy actually in the end decides to go back there. So this could be a story about how there is something beautiful in the mundane. But that's not the way popular culture has tended to depict it. Rather, people tend to remember Kansas as a place not that she goes back to at the end of the story, but as a place that for a while she was eager to get away from. You see it in books like this by Walter Updegrave, We're Not in Kansas Anymore, Strategies for Retiring Rich in a Totally Changed World. This is basically a how-to book on finances. And I've looked at it, and I can't find any single reference to Kansas anywhere in the book except in the title, which is indicative of popular culture in that the title is never really explained. It's self-explanatory. Anybody who looks at the cover of that book knows exactly what he's talking about. He's talking about how financial strategies today are totally different from what they've been in the past. But you could say anywhere in the world today, we're not in Kansas anymore, and it means that you're in new territory, something new, something interesting. And again, the juxtaposition is that Kansas is the old, the colorless, the flat, and the dry. Okay, for better or worse, that seems to be our image. Okay. Many years ago when I first went to Las Vegas and went to a nightclub and they had one of those comedians on stage who was doing the banter with the audience, asked me and a bunch of other guys where we were from. Kansas. Oh, look out. Well, welcome. How do you like electricity? How do you like indoor plumbing? I'm like, son of a, okay, so I never said anything, but you get the point. The notion of Kansas being dry is something that flows very much out of our Prohibition tradition. Now, Kansas still remained a legally dry state until 1949, 10 years after the Wizard of Oz movie came out. And then even after 1949, individual local communities had strict control over drinking. In fact, into the 1970s, some of you will see where I'm going with this immediately, Liquor by the drink was still outlawed. So you could go into a lot of Kansas taverns and order a beer, but if you wanted to get something stronger, you had to be a member of a private club. So it was really annoying for tourists, for people who were coming to Kansas and wanted to go out and have a bourbon, and they had to buy a special membership to a private club, maybe just for one night. So tavern owners always found ways around those laws, but those laws were still there. In the 1970s, we had a very active state attorney general. Some of you probably remember Vern Miller. Miller was a law enforcement officer originally from Wichita, had quite a good reputation there in his home city. And when he enters the state politics in the 1970s, he set the goal of strictly enforcing Kansas's prohibition laws. So there are a lot of great stories about Vern Miller. One of them was that he tried to stop Amtrak from serving alcohol as their passenger trains would cross through the state. And when he suggested doing the same for airplanes that were flying over Kansas, some of the late night comedians like Johnny Carson just had an absolute field day with him. So a lot of this again made national headlines, and people were scratching their heads and going, what in the world is going on out there in the middle of the country? Vern Miller actually had the support of a good part of the Kansas electorate until he made a fatal mistake. And politically, what am I talking about? He went after gambling, especially bingo, which was popular in small, rural Catholic communities. So his political support took a nosedive. But for a while, Vern Miller's attempt to enforce Kansas's drinking laws again lent this reputation of Kansas of being dry and uninteresting. So as we start to sort of wrap this up, and then I'll move to Q&A, I think I want to talk about the future of these images. So what are we going to be in the future? Are we going to continue to be a free, fiery, or a flat place? Or are those images going to go away? Are they going to be replaced by something else? Well, I don't have a crystal ball, so I don't know what the future is going to look like, but I have a few ideas. When we talk about the free state in Kansas, what most people right away think about is the eastern part of the state where Kansas was instrumental in the fight against slavery. So we tend to think about race in Kansas as being a black and white thing. But I'll suggest that when people teach this class 100 years from now, they won't be talking about it that way anymore. They're probably going to be looking at the southwest part of Kansas, at places like Dodge City, Garden City, Liberal, and it won't be a black-white thing. It'll be English-speaking and Spanish-speaking. Today, Hispanics are the largest, fastest-growing ethnic group in the state. And this is primarily because of the growth of the meatpacking industry in the southwest part of Kansas. For a variety of reasons, going back to the 1970s, a number of meatpacking plants shut down their operations in places like Chicago, St. Louis, and Kansas City, and moved closer to the feedlots, close to where the animals were located. One of the other reasons that was done, quite frankly, was to get away from the stringent labor laws, the power of the unions that you found in the metropolitan areas. So by moving to a part of the state that was known for cattle ranching, and also to a place where people took a more right-to-work mentality, the meatpacking industry began drawing thousands of immigrants, not only from Mexico, but from other parts of Central and South America, as well as from Asia. Okay, today, if you want a Vietnamese or a Laotian meal, your best bet at getting it will be to go to downtown Liberal, Kansas, way down close to the Texas and Oklahoma panhandles. Now, when I follow what's happening in the southwest part of the state, I find this so fascinating because I think this is really where the free state image that we like to hang on to is going to be tested. Again, we often think about race in a customary black-white sort of polar opposite. But when you get into the southwest part of the state today, it's much more complicated. Now, I think the video there paints somewhat of a rosy picture, perhaps, of Garden City. What they really don't get into is the amount of gang violence that has happened in Garden City. Also poverty. You've got all of the usual problems associated with illegal immigration, of ethnic rivalry. And back in the 1980s, as a lot of these changes were starting to happen, you also saw a proliferation of white supremacy groups. For a time in Dodge City, where two of the largest meatpacking plants were located, the group Posse Comitatus took over a local radio station and quite often would have daily broadcasts lambasting everybody from Ronald Reagan to the IRS as communist spies. Now, Ronald Reagan, a communist spy, that takes some imagination. But what's, I think, so fascinating is that these communities are facing problems related to diversity that major metropolitan areas still have not fixed after 150 plus years. So whatever you think about this, Kansas again is going to be front and center in fixing these issues of race, ethnic competition, and so forth. So I think we live in a pretty interesting place. In terms of Kansas as a fiery place, I still see it very much that way. All the things that William Allen White was saying about us 100 plus years ago, that Kansas is at the front of a lot of hot issues, I see all of that still happening today. Unless you've been living in a cave for the last 20 years, evolution has been front and center on a lot of people's issues, especially every time the State Board of Education changes its membership. The debate over whether evolution should be taught on a mandatory basis is one that always keeps coming back at the state level. Talk about downsizing government, lowering taxes, still very much in the news today. Several years ago, in the early part of this decade, in the aftermath of the Brown decision, there was a lawsuit that reached the state Supreme Court which claimed that the state government was not living up to its constitutional responsibilities to provide fair and equal education for all children. In other words, public schools were being underfunded. That case was settled. That case was won by the state Supreme Court, and the legislature has been fighting it ever since. So, does a child have a right to a certain minimum public education? That's a question that has yet to be settled, and again, we seem to be working on that one in Kansas. The debate over abortion has been in the headlines in the last few years with Operation Rescue in Wichita back in the early 90s, and if you remember just 2 or 3 years ago, the killing of George Tiller in Wichita. Issues like the environment, very front and center when it comes to recent debates over the building of coal plants, again, close to Garden City. You've seen quite a heated debate between environmental activists and representatives of the coal industry. That same debate relates to energy and even the old bugaboo of American history, secession, is still being debated in Kansas. Back in the 1990s, after the state raised taxes and changed some of the way it financed school districts, many western counties close to Colorado and Oklahoma found their taxes going up dramatically for the support of educating children in faraway places like Johnson County. Well, not coincidentally, there was a collection of about 15 counties in that neighborhood that tried to secede from the state of Kansas, take a few counties in Colorado and Oklahoma with them, and start a 51st state out in the middle of the country. So you think secession was settled by the Civil War? Well, it mostly was. Nobody paid much attention to this. But again, even the fact that it's talked about in certain rural libertarian communities, I think says something that, again, we're very much a fiery place. Let me start to wrap this up here with a look at the new What's the Matter with Kansas by Thomas Frank, subtitled How Conservatives Won the Heart of America. How many people have read this book? Okay. Thomas Frank deliberately titled this by using William Allen White's famous phrase from 1896, What's the Matter with Kansas? Tom Frank's basic thesis, as I understand it, is that Kansas has really not changed in 100 years, but the political parties have. That is, back in William Allen White's day, Kansas was a collection of rural people who cared devoutly about issues, and they saw the enemy of small rural people as the big business Eastern establishment, and that was their real enemy. And that's why they joined the Populist Party. That's why some of them joined the Democratic Party. Frank argues that today those same people believe all the things they once did, but they are voting Republican, which we now label conservative. Because, he says, the Republican Party has done a pretty good job of diverting people's attention away from economic issues, which is what the populists were about, toward cultural issues. So the Eastern establishment then was the big businesses and the railroads. Today, the Eastern establishment is the cultural liberal who sips the lattes, drives the Volvo, and is out of step, out of touch with the average working American. Now, Frank doesn't hide his liberal leanings. He takes some pretty good shots here at the Republican Party. But as I read that book at the end of the day, what he really says is that the Republicans are master politicians. He's actually a whole lot harder on the Democrats. He's saying that the Democrats have kind of forgotten those base bread and butter issues that once made them strong. So in other words, he's arguing that Kansas has always been a state where people believe a certain set of things, but it's the way we define these labels like liberal and conservative that have changed over time. We haven't changed, but the way we talk about politics really has. So whatever you think of the Tom Frank thesis, this book made quite a splash at the national level. I encourage you to read it. Because he got people talking once again about how Kansas, for all of its flat image, is still a pretty interesting place to live. So I've talked about free, I've talked about fiery. We can't really do much about the flatness of the state. I mean, we can fix a lot, but we can't fix our topography. But I think we can change the way we think about it. We can change our perceptions. And I rather like this quote from Dr. Carl Menninger, founder of the Menninger Clinic in Topeka. We live in a beautiful state, a state settled by brave, intelligent, and visionary people, even if our intelligence and vision do not seem to have prevented us from developing a vast inferiority. Not real inferiority, but a feeling of inferiority. In other words, we've allowed other people to define us. Okay, Kansans are not aggressive when it comes to being proud. They've allowed themselves to be shaped, their image to be shaped by people who don't live here. So I'm going to conclude by advocating that we change that and that we embrace our flatness a little bit. I like to tell my students, any fool can love a mountain or a beach, but it takes a really special person to love the Great Plains. And I do. Hope you do too. So, thank you.